Clara Bennett did not cry when the boy told her the man she came to marry was dead. She stood on that platform in the August heat, 2 suitcases at her feet, a crumpled letter pressed against her chest, and she looked at 15-year-old Ethan Whitaker, this exhausted, hollow-eyed boy who had clearly not slept in days, and she said the only thing she could manage, "How many?" He blinked. "Ma'am? How many children are waiting at home?" He hesitated. Then quietly, 7. Clara picked up both suitcases. "Then take me there." If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel right now, hit that notification bell and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The letter was dated April 14, 1876, and Clara Bennett had read it so many times the paper had gone soft along the fold lines. "I am not a man of many words, Miss Bennett, but I will say this plainly. I am a widower with children who need a mother's presence, and I am a man who believes he still has something worth offering. I will not deceive you about what life here looks like. It is hard. The land is unforgiving. But there is something honest about this place, and I believe an honest woman would find her footing here faster than she might expect. If you are willing to make the journey, I will meet you at the station in Willow Creek on August the 3rd. I will be the man in the brown coat holding a sunflower, because my late wife believed sunflowers were the only flower brave enough to follow the sun." James Whitaker had sent that letter in April. By August, James Whitaker was in the ground. Clara had not known. The letter informing her of his death had crossed her own departure somewhere in the middle of the country. 2 pieces of paper passing each other on opposite trains, delivering news that arrived too late to matter. She had boarded the westbound train out of Columbus, Ohio on July 29th with 2 leather suitcases, $43 folded inside her left boot, a Bible her mother had pressed into her hands at the station platform, and a heart that had taken 3 years of quiet convincing before it agreed to hope again. She was 29 years old. She had buried her father at 24, her mother at 26, and a brief, gentle engagement at 27, when the man she thought she would marry decided the responsibility of a woman with no family and no property was more than he had bargained for. He had not been cruel about it. That almost made it worse. He had sat across from her at her kitchen table, turned his hat in his hands 3 times and said, "Clara, you deserve someone who can give you more than I'm able to." Then he left, and she had sat at that table until the candle burned itself out, understanding for the first time what it felt like to be a burden that someone had quietly set down. She had spent the next 2 years taking in sewing work and teaching reading to the children of neighbors who could afford small payments and those who could not. She lived carefully. She did not complain. She told herself that a quiet life was not a small life, and most days she almost believed it. Then the advertisement had appeared in the Columbus Dispatch in January of 1876. Widower, Colorado Territory, 41 years, rancher, father to children, seeks correspondence with steady, kind-hearted woman of good character, willing to consider Western life. Respond to J. Whitaker, Willow Creek, Colorado. She had read it 4 times before she clipped it from the paper with her sewing scissors. She told herself she was only curious. She told herself she would write 1 letter and see. She told herself many things in January that February disproved entirely, because by February she and James Whitaker were exchanging letters every 2 weeks, and by April she understood that whatever this was, it was the most honest conversation she had ever had with another human being. He did not flatter her. He told her the truth about the ranch, the truth about the grief still sitting in the house. Like furniture, nobody had moved. He told her his children were good, but damaged that the oldest boy carried too much and the youngest girl barely spoke. He told her that he was not looking for a woman to fix anything. He was looking for a woman willing to stand inside the broken places without flinching. Clara had written back, "I have been standing inside broken places my entire life, Mr. Whitaker. I believe I know the terrain." He had written, "Then come west, Miss Bennett. The sunflower will be waiting." She had said yes. She had meant it completely. And now she was standing on the platform at Willow Creek, Colorado, in the flat, hard August heat, and the man in the brown coat with the sunflower was nowhere. The platform was nearly empty. A few townspeople moved past with their own business. A dog lay sleeping in a strip of shade near the station wall. And at the edge of the platform, slightly apart from everything, stood a boy. He was tall for his age, broad across the shoulders, in the way of someone who had been doing physical work for years, but his face was still young, too young for the expression it was carrying. His clothes were clean but worn. His boots needed resoling. He had dark eyes that tracked her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read strangers quickly, and when she walked toward him, because he was the only person on that platform paying any attention to her at all, he straightened and took his hat off. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm Ethan Whitaker." He held his hat in both hands. "James Whitaker's son." Clara looked past him toward the platform exit, expecting the brown coat, the sunflower. "Your father," she began. "Ma'am." Ethan said it quietly without flinching, but she could see what it cost him. "My father passed 3 weeks ago come Thursday. It was his heart. It went fast. The doctor said he likely didn't suffer." He paused. "I'm sorry you weren't told sooner. We sent a letter, but we didn't know exactly when you'd left." Clara heard the words. She understood them individually, but for a moment they did not assemble into meaning in any way she could act on. She stood very still with her 2 suitcases at her feet, and the August sun pressing down on her shoulders, and she thought with strange clarity about the letter in her trunk, describing a man in a brown coat holding a sunflower. "I see," she finally said. Ethan Whitaker watched her with those careful dark eyes. She could see him waiting for the tears, the questions, the declaration that she would need to go back, the ordinary and expected response of a woman who had just been told the reason for her journey no longer existed. Clara looked at him steadily. "How many?" she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, how many children are at home waiting?" Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly. More like the specific surprise of a person who had braced for impact and found the blow landed differently than expected. "7, he said, counting me. Clara picked up both suitcases by their handles. "Then take me there," she said. "We'll sort out the rest as we go." She saw him blink again. She saw the swallow move in his throat. And then Ethan Whitaker, 15 years old, and trying very hard to carry the weight of 7 lives on shoulders that hadn't finished growing yet, put his hat back on his head, turned and led her to the wagon. He did not speak much on the drive out to the ranch. Clara did not press him. She watched the land, the wide, dry scrub, the distant blue ridge of mountains, the sky that went on so far, it seemed like a dare, and she let the fact of James Whitaker's death settle into her bones, the way cold settles slowly and completely. She had grieved before. She knew how it worked. You did not push it away. You let it come in and find its room, and you kept moving anyway. She was sad. She would give that its proper weight later privately. But she was also here. And from what she could see, riding beside this wordless boy, here needed her. The ranch came into view after 40 minutes on the road. A main house with a wraparound porch that had once been handsome and now showed the specific tiredness of a place without enough hands to maintain it. 2 outbuildings, a barn fencing that had been mended in some places and was failing in others. There was a kitchen garden alongside the house that had clearly been tended recently, somewhat desperately, by someone who knew what they were doing but didn't have enough time. And on the porch, arranged in a ragged line that had the feeling of something spontaneous rather than planned, were 6 children. Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for Ethan to help her. She straightened her traveling dress, which was wrinkled and dusty from the train, and she looked at the porch. The oldest girl, 13, maybe 14, stood at the front with her arms crossed and her chin at an angle Clara recognized immediately as armor. A boy of about 10 stood slightly behind and to the side, turning a small metal wrench in his hands, the way other children fidgeted with toys. 2 smaller girls, identical 7 years old perhaps, stood pressed together at the shoulder, like they had learned that being one solid thing was safer than being 2 separate small ones. A little boy, 5 or so, stood slightly apart from the others, his eyes going past Clara toward the road behind the wagon, with the particular desperate attention of someone who is still waiting for a different person to arrive. And in the doorway, half hidden by the frame, was a small girl, 3, maybe just turned 3, watching everything with enormous dark eyes and one fist pressed to her mouth. Clara stood at the base of the porch steps and looked at all of them. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said clearly without performance. "I came from Ohio to marry your father. I know he's gone. I'm sorry for that, sorrier than I can find the right words for right now." She paused. "I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect you to be glad I'm here, or to pretend this situation makes any sense, because it doesn't, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it does." Another pause. "I thought I'd stay a few days and make sure everyone is eating properly and the house is in order. After that, we'll decide together what makes sense." The girl with crossed arms. The 13-year-old spoke first. "You don't need to stay," she said. Her voice was flat. Not rude exactly, but sealed shut. "We've been managing." "I can see that," Clara said. "You've done a remarkable job. We don't need your pity." "Good," Clara said. "I wasn't offering any." That created a small charged silence. The girl's eyes narrowed slightly, recalibrating. Clara waited. "I'm Lydia," the girl finally said, though her arms stayed crossed. "Lydia." Clara nodded. "Is there a room where I could wash my face and hands before I help with supper?" Another pause. Lydia looked at Ethan. Ethan gave the smallest possible shrug that said he had no more information than anyone else did. Lydia looked back at Clara. "There's a room," she said. "Upstairs. It's small." "Small is fine," Clara said. "I've slept in smaller." She picked up her suitcases and went up the porch steps, and the children parted to let her through. Through not warmly, not easily, but they moved. The little girl in the doorway pressed back against the frame as Clara passed, and Clara stopped. She crouched down so she was level with the child's face. "Hi," she said softly. "What's your name?" The little girl stared at her, didn't speak. "You don't have to tell me today," Clara said. "I'll be around." She straightened and went inside. The room Lydia directed her to was at the end of the upstairs hall, a narrow space with a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden, a bed frame with a mattress that was passable, and a washstand with a cracked pitcher that someone had filled with water recently. Clara set down her suitcases and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the garden below. She was still looking when she heard a small sound in the doorway and turned to find the 10-year-old boy standing there, the wrench still in his hand. "Samuel," he said before she could ask. "I'm Samuel. I'm 10. "Hello, Samuel." He looked at the cracked pitcher on the washstand. "I can fix that," he said. "If you want. The crack. I've been meaning to, but there's always something else." He paused. "I could put a wire wrap around it. It won't be the same as before, but it won't leak." Clara looked at the pitcher and then at Samuel. "I'd appreciate that very much," she said. "Thank you." He gave a short nod, business like a miniature of someone much older, and left. Clara turned back to this window and allowed herself approximately 30 seconds of the particular private grief of a woman who had traveled 800 miles toward a hope and arrived at a ruin. She breathed it in and breathed it out. Then she rolled up her sleeves, poured water from the cracked pitcher into the basin, and washed her hands. There was supper to start. There were 6-7 children who needed to eat. Clara Bennett had not come west to be fragile. She went downstairs. The kitchen was large, with a big iron stove that was the clear heart of the room, and a long table that had been built by someone who expected it to hold a crowd. Clara found flour, salt, dried beans, a reasonable quantity of potatoes, some smoked bacon, going a bit past its prime, and several jars of preserved vegetables on the cellar shelves. She found eggs, a good number of them, which meant someone was keeping the chickens fed and regular. She found butter, slightly more salt than necessary in everything, and a cast iron skillet that had been seasoned for years and was currently the finest piece of equipment in the kitchen. She pulled up her sleeves and got to work. She was midway through slicing potatoes when Lydia appeared in the kitchen doorway and stood there watching her with the particular calculating attention of a girl trying to decide whether someone is real or performing. Clara didn't look up from the potatoes. "Can you start the stove?" she said. "I'd do it myself, but I don't know where you keep your kindling." A pause. "Box by the back door," Lydia said. "Would you mind?" Another pause. Longer. Then the sound of Lydia crossing the kitchen and crouching by the stove. Clara kept slicing potatoes. "You actually know how to cook," Lydia said after a few minutes. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been cooking since I was 7, Clara said. "My mother worked long hours. I learned early." She set the potato slices in a pattern in the skillet. "What does everyone like?" "Any strong objections to anything on the shelves?" "Benjamin doesn't like beans." Lydia had the stove going now and stood with her arms crossed again, watching. "He won't say so, but he doesn't eat them. He just moves them around." Noted. Clara put the lid on the skillet and moved to the bean pot. "What does he like?" Lydia blinked. It was a small blink, but Clara caught it the surprise of being asked something practical rather than sentimental. "Bread," Lydia said. "And eggs. Pretty much anything with eggs. I'll make eggs then." Clara turned to look at her. "Lydia, I want you to know something. I'm not going to pretend I'm your mother. I'm not going to pretend any of this is easy or that I know how it's supposed to go from here. But I'm not going to disappear on you either. I want to make that clear from the start. I don't disappear." Lydia looked at her for a long moment with that sealed expression. "Everybody disappears," she said. "I know it's felt that way." Clara turned back to the stove. "I'd like to show you something different if you'll give me the time." Lydia didn't answer, but she also didn't leave the kitchen. She stood at the edge and watched, and after a while she started helping without being asked. Setting the table, pouring water, cutting the bread, doing the work with a crisp competency that made it obvious she had been running this kitchen for weeks. When supper was on the table, and all 7 children were seated, Ethan at the head, where Clara understood without being told that he had been sitting out of necessity for 3 weeks. Clara took the remaining chair and looked around the table. "I don't know all your names yet," she said. "And I'd like to. Would you tell me?" She looked at the twins. "Anna," said one. "Rose," said the other. "Anna, Rose." Clara nodded at each. "And you?" She looked at the small boy who had been watching the road. He was still distracted, still somewhere else partly, but he turned when she addressed him. "Benjamin," he said, quietly. Like his voice was a small thing he kept guarded. "Benjamin." And finally Clara turned to the small girl at the end of the bench, pressed against Anna's side, enormous dark eyes fixed on the plate in front of her. "Lucy," Anna supplied when the little girl didn't speak. "She doesn't talk much. She did before, but—" Anna stopped, glanced at Ethan. "She talks when she's ready," Ethan said. His voice had a careful flatness to it, the tone of someone who has repeated that explanation many times and needs it to remain true. "That's just fine," Clara said. She looked at Lucy and smiled, not brightly, not performed, but the small, honest smile of a woman meaning what she says. "You don't have to talk to me, Lucy. I'm just going to be here." Lucy stared at her, then looked down at her plate. Clara picked up her fork. "Let's eat," she said. They ate. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't nothing. The food was good. Clara made good food reliably, and without fuss, and after 2 weeks of Lydia's competent but overstretched cooking. A full hot meal produced by different hands created a small shift in the room's atmosphere that Clara noted without commenting on. Ethan ate seriously and said little. Lydia watched Clara throughout the meal with the steady suspicion of a person waiting to identify the moment when the mask slips. Samuel ate quickly and asked to be excused early because he had promised himself he'd get the east fence repaired before dark. Benjamin ate his eggs with quiet concentration and moved his beans around in the practiced pattern of a boy who has been doing this for a long time. The twins ate side by side and whispered to each other constantly, so quietly that nothing was intelligible but the sound of it. The constant soft ribbon of private communication was clearly as necessary to them as breathing. And Lucy ate half her food and then fell asleep, sitting up between Anna and Clara, her head eventually dropping sideways to rest against Clara's arm. Clara felt the warm weight of that small head on her arm and sat very still so as not to disturb it. Across the table, Ethan watched this and said nothing, but something in his jaw went soft in a way that he didn't manage to stop in time. After supper, when the younger children were headed toward bed and Clara was washing dishes. Ethan came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." He stood there. Clara kept washing. "She didn't let anyone hold her for the first 2 weeks," he said. "Lucy, after Pa died, she wouldn't." He paused. "She fell asleep on you." Clara set a clean plate on the drying cloth. "She was tired," she said. "Yeah." Another pause. "I know you didn't sign up for this, for all of this. And I know my father, I know what he probably wrote to you in those letters wasn't—" He stopped. "He was a good man. He really was. He was sick for longer than he told anybody, including me." Clara turned to look at him. Ethan was standing very straight, holding himself together with the specific rigid posture of a boy who has decided that if he moves too quickly, the whole structure will come apart. "He told me to meet the train," he said. "In his last letter, he said, 'Ethan, if I'm not there, meet the train because Miss Bennett is a good woman and she deserves not to be left standing alone.' So that's what I did." Clara looked at this boy for a long moment. "Your father sounds like he was exactly who he described himself to be," she said. Ethan blinked hard. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "He was." "Go get some sleep, Ethan," she said gently. "You've been carrying this for 3 weeks. I'm here now. You don't have to carry all of it tonight." He stood there another moment. Then he gave a single sharp nod, the nod of someone accepting a weight transfer he isn't entirely sure about, and went upstairs. Clara finished the dishes. She blew out the kitchen lamp and went to the window for a moment, looking out at the dark land, the enormous sky going purple at the edges where the sun had given up on it for the night. Somewhere out in the grass, an animal moved. The barn was quiet. The house behind her was quiet too now, and it was a different quality of quiet than it had probably been for 3 weeks, a little less held in place, a little less desperate. She had nowhere else to be. She turned away from the window and went upstairs to her small room. 3 days passed. Then a week. Clara did not announce herself or make declarations. She simply worked. She was in the kitchen before anyone else was awake, which meant Ethan, who had taken to rising at first light out of the specific guilt of someone who believes the moment he rests, something will fall, came downstairs to find coffee already made and the beginnings of breakfast underway. He stood in the kitchen doorway the first morning with the expression of a person who doesn't know whether to be grateful or resentful, and Clara handed him a cup of coffee and said, "The east fence is done. Samuel told me. He did good work." "He always does," Ethan said, and took the coffee and sat down. She worked beside Ethan repairing the section of roof on the smaller outbuilding that had been letting water in. She did not pretend to be stronger or more skilled than she was, but she was useful, and she climbed a ladder without hesitation, and handed tools, and held boards, and held her weight on the roof when it was necessary. Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye the whole time, and said nothing about it. She spent an afternoon with Samuel at the workbench in the barn, asking questions about what he was building a small cabinet. It turned out with dovetail joints he'd taught himself from a book, and not offering advice he hadn't asked for, just listening and asking the right questions, the kind that showed she understood what he was describing. Samuel was not a child who thawed easily, but he was a child who responded to being taken seriously, and by the end of the afternoon, he was talking at full length about the properties of different kinds of wood and whether pine or cedar held joinery better in dry mountain air. "Cedar," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, surprised that she'd known. "My father built furniture," she said. "Pine warps. He always said if you can get cedar, get cedar." Samuel looked at her with new evaluation. "I'll use cedar then," he said. She helped the twins Anna and Rose with the washing 2 days in. They were not precisely shy, but they were careful. These two, they operated as a unit and watched from behind each other and communicated in the private shorthand of children who have spent every moment of their lives together. Clara did not try to separate them or address them individually at first. She just worked alongside them, and when they whispered to each other, she let them whisper. And after a while they started whispering things that were clearly about her, and then Rose looked up and said very directly, "Did you love our father?" Clara wrung water from a shirt and thought about that. "I thought I might," she said. "I think I was on my way to it. He was a remarkable man in his letters. He was a remarkable man in person too, Anna said. Then I'm sorry I didn't get the chance to know him that way, Clara said. The twins looked at each other. Some communication passed between them. He talked about you, Rose said finally. In the last weeks, he told Ethan to watch for a woman from Ohio who would arrive in August and that she would be the kind of woman who didn't need to be told twice what to do. Clara felt something press against the inside of her chest. That's very kind, she said. He said she'd make good bread, Anna added. Clara laughed genuinely without preparation. It surprised her. Well, she said. Let's see if he was right about that too. She noticed that Benjamin the 5-year-old spent part of every late afternoon at the front window. She didn't comment on it for 4 days. On the 5th day, she brought a cup of warm milk to where he was sitting on the window bench and sat down beside him. He looked up at her sideways. You're watching for something, she said. He looked back out the window. I know Pa's not coming back, he said, very quietly. I know that. I believe you, Clara said. He stopped. His small fingers were pressed flat against the glass. Sometimes I watch in case. In case of what? He thought about it for a moment. In case someone else comes, he said. Someone who wants to stay. Clara looked out the window at the road in the last light. Benjamin, she said carefully, I'm already here. He looked at her. His eyes were still James Whittaker's eyes, dark and watchful, and trying hard to trust the world again. You might leave, he said. I might, Clara said, but I haven't yet. He looked at the road again. Okay, he said. She sat with him until the light was gone. He drank his milk. She looked at the road too. It was Lydia who was the hardest, and Lydia who mattered most, and they both knew it. Lydia had been running this house. Lydia had been making decisions and managing rationing and keeping the younger ones from falling apart. She had done it without being asked because she was 13 and practical and the oldest girl, and because the alternative was for everything to come undone. She had done it with competence and without complaint and at considerable cost to herself, and she was not going to let someone walk in from Ohio and make any of that invisible. Clara understood this precisely. She did not try to take the kitchen from Lydia. She joined it. She asked Lydia's opinion on what needed to be preserved before winter. She brought problems to Lydia before solving them herself. She said, "What do you think?" with the genuine intention of using the answer. On the 9th day, Lydia came to find her in the garden. The cellar shelf is rotting, Lydia said. It's been going since spring. If it gives way before we get the winter preserves down there, we lose everything. Can Samuel fix it? He needs materials. Wood. Good wood, not the scraps we have. How much would it cost? Lydia named a figure. Clara did the math against what she had in her boot. All right, she said. We'll go to town Thursday. You can help me pick the right lumber. Lydia looked at her. You're staying through winter, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm staying, Clara said. Nobody asked you to. I know. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Lydia, Clara said carefully, you don't have to trust me today, or this week. Trust takes time, and it should. But I want you to know what you've done for these children in the last 3 weeks, the way you held this family together, that took more courage than most adults I've ever known. Lydia's jaw tightened. She looked away. You are not our mother, she said. Quieter now than the first time. No, Clara said. I'm not. I'm the woman your father wrote to, and I got here late, and I'm sorry about that. But I'm here now. And whatever I am to this family, it isn't someone who's going to walk away when it gets hard. Lydia didn't answer. But when she walked back toward the house, she walked more slowly than she'd come, as if something that had been wound tight inside her had been let out just the smallest amount. On the night of the 13th day, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight, writing a letter to a friend back in Columbus, explaining what had happened, explaining that she was staying, trying to put into language a decision that she wasn't entirely sure she could explain logically when she heard small feet on the stairs. She looked up. Lucy was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had her eyes fixed on Clara with that particular solemn attention Clara had come to recognize as the little girl's primary mode of engagement with the world. She was holding a small cloth rabbit by one ear. Clara set down her pen. "Can't sleep," she said softly. Lucy crossed the kitchen without speaking and climbed up onto the bench beside Clara's chair and pressed herself against Clara's side and closed her eyes. Clara sat very still. Then she put her arm around the small girl and held her gently, and Lucy made a sound that was not quite a word, but was very clearly a settling. A sound like something finding the place it had been looking for. Clara kept her arm around her and picked up her pen and kept writing. She had written halfway down the page when Lucy, asleep now and making small, slow breaths against Clara's side, said something. A syllable half-formed. Clara stopped writing. She was almost certain she had heard wrong, but she waited very still. "Ma," Lucy said again in her sleep, barely audible. A word tested against the dark, found to hold weight and kept. Clara set down the pen. She sat in the kitchen with a sleeping child pressed against her side, and the lamp burning low on the table, and the big dark sky pressing against the windows, and she understood with the specific calm of a woman who has stopped arguing with the things that are true that she was not going home. She was already home. What she had not yet discovered, what was moving toward Willow Creek, even as she sat in that warm kitchen, was the man who had already decided this family's home was his to take. His name was Victor Caldwell. He was wealthy, connected, and patient in the way that predators are patient when they have already decided the outcome. He had noticed the Whitaker Ranch months ago, when James Whitaker was still alive, and the property's value near the river was becoming increasingly obvious to people who measured land in dollars, rather than in the lives that had been built on it. He had made quiet inquiries. He had waited. And now there was no husband. No father. Just a woman from Ohio with $43 in her boot and 7 children to feed and a winter coming that would test every resource the ranch had. Victor Caldwell had looked at that situation and seen an opportunity. What he had not looked closely enough at was Clara Bennett herself. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. Victor Caldwell's first letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara was in the barn with Ethan when Lydia came through the door, holding an envelope with both hands, the way a person carries something they already know is trouble. "This came with the supply wagon," Lydia said. "It's addressed to the estate of James Whitaker." Ethan reached for it. "Let me," Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back. Not a challenge, just a woman understanding that this was now her responsibility too, whether anyone had officially decided that or not. Ethan lowered his hand. Clara took the envelope, broke the seal, and read. The letter was from a firm called Caldwell Land and Property, headquartered in Denver. It was written in the careful, pleasant language of people who have learned that the most frightening things sound better when dressed in courtesy. It informed the estate of James Whitaker that certain questions had arisen regarding the original land grant documentation for the Whitaker property, and that a representative of Caldwell Land and Property would be pleased to visit at the family's earliest convenience to discuss these matters in a spirit of mutual benefit. Clara read it twice. "What does it say?" Ethan asked. She folded it along its original crease. "It says someone has noticed we're without a man on this property," she said, "and they'd like to come have a look." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Caldwell. You know the name. Pa mentioned it. Said there was a man in Denver buying up land along the river. Said he'd had inquiries." Ethan pulled a feed sack off the nearest shelf and slung it over his shoulder with a hard, efficient motion. "Pa told him the ranch wasn't for sale." "And now your father isn't here to tell him again," Clara said. She put the letter in her apron pocket and picked up the bucket she'd set down when Lydia arrived. "I'll write back," she said. "I'll tell them we received their correspondence and that all questions about the property can be directed to our legal representative." Ethan stared at her. "We don't have a legal representative," he said. "Not yet," Clara said. She walked out of the barn and crossed the yard to the house, and inside the pocket of her apron, the letter sat folded and waiting, and Clara Bennett walked faster than she normally did, because the particular cold anger now moving through her chest needed somewhere to go, and moving was better than standing still. She found Thomas Reed's name through the preacher, who found it through the dry goods owner, who said Thomas Reed was the only attorney within 40 miles who wasn't already in Caldwell's pocket, which was itself a piece of information Clara filed carefully away. She rode to town the following Thursday with Lydia. Beside her on the wagon seat, the cellar shelf lumber loaded in the back, along with the list Lydia had made of everything they needed before the first snow. The lumber yard took 40 minutes. The attorney's office took considerably longer. Thomas Reed was a thin man in his mid-40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the particular careful stillness of someone who has trained himself to listen before he speaks. He stood when Clara entered his office, which she noted and appreciated. He offered her the chair across from his desk, which she took. "I understand you're the woman who came to marry James Whittaker," he said. "I am," Clara said. "He died before I arrived. I stayed." Reed's expression was neutral, but not unkind. "And what can I do for you, Miss Bennett?" She put the Caldwell letter on his desk. He read it. She watched his face. He read it again. "How long have you been on the property?" he asked. 2 weeks. "And the children, how old is the eldest?" "Ethan is 15. "There's no adult male relative who could act as guardian." "There is not." Reed set the letter down and removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a deliberate slowness that Clara recognized as thinking time. "Miss Bennett," he said, "Caldwell is not a man who sends letters for fun. If he's making noises about the land grant documentation, it means someone has already been through the county records looking for a weakness." He replaced his spectacles. "The question is whether they found one. And if they did, then we need to find it first and understand what we're dealing with." He paused. "I want to be straightforward with you. A widow." "I'm not a widow," Clara said. "I was a bride-to-be. He died before I arrived." "A woman," Reed corrected without embarrassment. "Without legal standing as guardian on a property with documentation that may be in question with 7 minor children." "Miss Bennett, that is a situation Caldwell has successfully exploited before, against families with more legal footing than yours." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Then help me build more footing," she said. Reed looked at her for a long moment. "I'll need access to whatever documents James kept regarding the property," he said. "Deed grant paperwork, any correspondence with the county land office. I'll find them. And I'll need a retainer." Clara told him what she had. He quoted her a figure that was less than she expected, which told her something about Thomas Reed that she filed alongside everything else. "I'll send the first payment when I get home," she said, and stood. He stood too, and offered his hand, which she shook. "Miss Bennett," he said, "for what it's worth, what you're doing for those children is not a small thing." "It's not a large thing either," Clara said. "It's just the thing in front of me." She went back to the wagon where Lydia was sitting with her arms crossed and her eyes on the street, tracking the town's movements with the hypervigilance of a girl who had learned early that the world required monitoring. "Well," Lydia said. "We have a lawyer," Clara said, climbing up. Lydia looked at her. "Can we afford a lawyer?" "Barely," Clara said. "But barely is enough for now." She clicked the horse forward, and they rolled down the main street of Willow Creek, and Clara kept her eyes straight ahead and her hands easy on the reins, and did not let Lydia see the way her own heartbeat had climbed, because Lydia needed steadiness right now, more than she needed honesty about how frightened Clara actually was. The documents were in a tin box under James Whittaker's bed. Ethan knew about it, had known for weeks, but hadn't opened it because opening it felt like the final admission that James was gone and wasn't coming back to handle his own affairs. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and waited while Ethan stood in the doorway deciding. "You don't have to be in the room," she said. "He's my father," Ethan said. "Then come sit down." He came in. He sat in the chair by the window. Clara lifted the box onto the bed and opened it. Inside the original land deed, the homestead grant, a letter from the county land office dated 1869, correspondence with a surveyor about the river boundary, several receipts, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilskin, a letter in handwriting Clara recognized as the same hand that had written to her in Ohio. She held it for a moment. "Is that?" Ethan started. "Yes," Clara said. She set it aside. We'll look at the legal documents first. That one is private and it can wait. She worked through the paperwork with careful attention, making notes on the margins of the sheet she'd brought from town. The deed was solid filed and witnessed. The homestead grant was original and in good order. The river boundary survey was where she slowed down, because the language describing the eastern edge of the property was slightly different in the surveyor's correspondence than in the original grant. And that kind of slight difference was exactly the kind of thing someone looking for a weakness would find. "This survey," she said. "When was this done?" 1872, Ethan said. He had moved to sit on the edge of the bed beside her, looking at the documents. Pa hired a surveyor to settle a question with the neighbor to the east, about where exactly the property line hit the river. And who conducted it? A man named Harlow, from Denver. Clara wrote down the name. "Did your father ever mention if Harlow worked for anyone regularly, any particular land company?" Ethan looked at her. "You think the survey was rigged," he said. "I think it's worth asking," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Pa trusted him," he said. "He was recommended by someone in town." A pause. "By the bank manager." Clara wrote that down too. She picked up the oilskin letter and handed it to Ethan. "This is for you," she said. "I think he wrote it knowing he might not have much time. Take it somewhere private." Ethan took it with both hands. He stood. He stood there for a moment without moving, holding his father's last letter, and Clara looked back at the documents on the bed and gave him the privacy of not watching his face. "Miss Bennett," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for not opening it." "It was never mine to open," she said. He went out. She heard his boots on the stairs, heard the back door open and close, and knew he'd gone out to the barn, where he could be alone. She sat on the edge of James Whittaker's bed with the deed and the grant and the survey and the banker's recommendation in her hands, and felt the shape of what they were up against begin to clarify in her mind. It was not a comfortable shape, but Clara had always found it easier to face a clear, hard truth than to keep pressing against a fog. She knew what kind of man Victor Caldwell was. She had known men shaped that way before, not necessarily in Colorado, not necessarily in land deals, but the fundamental architecture was the same. Men who surveyed the landscape for weakness, who moved in the particular patient way of those who have resources and time, and who have learned that most obstacles eventually run out of one or both. He had been circling this property for months, maybe longer, and he had waited for the moment when the obstacle James Whittaker was gone. What he had not predicted was that another obstacle would step off a train from Ohio and refuse to be moved. Clara folded the documents carefully and put them back in the tin box. She was going to need more than a lawyer. She was going to need the town. The following Sunday, Clara went to church. This was not a decision about faith. Clara's faith was her own business, and she kept it private. This was a decision about community, because Willow Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone's affairs, and large enough that there were people in it who had their own grievances against Victor Caldwell, and had never had anyone to stand beside. She went with all 7 children, which required the first genuine coordination effort the family had undertaken together. Getting 7 children dressed and into the wagon, in anything resembling order, was, Clara discovered, like trying to organize a river. The general direction was manageable, but the individual currents did whatever they liked. Benjamin's shoes couldn't be found. Rose's braid came undone twice. Samuel was in the barn and had to be retrieved. The twins argued about who sat where on the wagon seat with the focused intensity of people debating something of great constitutional importance. And through all of it, Ethan stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was somewhere between bewildered and almost smiling, which was the closest thing to a smile Clara had seen from him in 2 weeks. When they finally pulled out of the yard, Lucy was asleep against Clara's side before they'd gone a quarter mile. "She does that a lot," Anna said. "She likes you," Rose said. "She falls asleep on people she feels safe with," Ethan said quietly from Clara's other side. Then he seemed to realize he'd said something that revealed too much, and he looked away at the road. Clara said nothing. She kept one hand on the reins and one arm around Lucy, and let that be what it was. The church in Willow Creek was a plain white building with wooden pews and a preacher named Hartwell, who had the big carrying voice of a man who understood that the back row deserved to hear as much as the front. He greeted Clara after the service with genuine warmth and introduced her to several people by name before she'd asked him to, which she appreciated. She met a woman named Margaret Haynes, who ran the general store with her husband and who had eyes that took in everything and a handshake like she meant it. She met the Delacroix family, 3 generations of farmers who had homesteaded the valley before the Whitakers, and who Margaret told her under her breath had once had their own trouble with Caldwell's people over water rights. She met a man named Harlan Cole, who was a large, quiet former lawman with a silver badge still pinned to his vest out of habit, who shook Clara's hand and said, "You're the woman who stayed," with a tone that was not a question. "Yes," Clara said. He nodded once the way men from that part of the country nodded when they'd made up their mind about something. She met and spoke and listened, and by the time the afternoon was done, she had a clear picture of what Willow Creek knew about Victor Caldwell, which was more than she'd expected, and a clearer picture of what it feared, which was also more than she'd expected. He had resources, lawyers' connections in Denver, a relationship with the territorial governor's office that people spoke about with the particular hushed tone they reserved for things that felt too large to fight directly. But he also, she noted, had enemies. People he had hurt or tried to hurt who remembered it. "Miss Bennett," Margaret Haynes said, catching her arm before she loaded the children back into the wagon. "You need to know something. There was a family 3 years ago, name of Pruitt. Young couple, children, property east of yours along the same river. Caldwell found a question in their paperwork. Within 6 months they were gone. The property sold at a price nobody in this county thought was fair." She paused. "I don't tell you that to frighten you. I tell you so you know what you're dealing with." "I know what I'm dealing with," Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said. She released Clara's arm. "Because if you decide to fight it, you won't be fighting alone." Clara absorbed that without showing how much it mattered. She climbed up to the wagon, gathered Lucy back into the space beside her, and turned toward home. The second letter from Caldwell came 10 days later. This one was less pleasant. It informed the estate of James Whitaker that a preliminary review of county land records had revealed potential inconsistencies in the boundary survey conducted in 1872, and that Caldwell Land and Property would be seeking clarification from the Territorial Land Office. It further noted that pending resolution of these questions, any improvements to or use of the disputed land area, which it defined in language so carefully vague, it could mean almost anything might be considered premature. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Ethan and Thomas Reed on either side of her. "He's getting specific," Reed said. "He found the survey discrepancy," Clara said. "Or he created it," Ethan said. Reed looked at him. "That's exactly the question," Reed said. "And it's the right one." He set the letter down. "If we can establish that the 1872 survey was conducted by a man with a financial relationship to Caldwell, the entire document becomes compromised, which means their challenge falls apart." "Can we establish that?" Clara asked. "I can try." Reed paused. "It will require someone going through records in Denver. Land Office Surveyors Licensing Board property transactions." He paused again. "That takes time and money." Clara thought about the money in her boot, which was getting thinner. "How much time?" she said. "A month, maybe 6 weeks." She looked at Ethan. Ethan had his father's jaw. She'd noticed that before. He said it the same way James had probably said it. "We have 6 weeks," he said. "Caldwell is going to apply pressure in the meantime," Reed said. "He'll send people. He may make contact directly. He may try to convince individual family members that settling is in their best interest." "He won't convince me," Ethan said. "It's not you I'd worry about," Reed said carefully. "It's the younger ones. If he can create enough fear." "Nobody talks to the younger children without going through me or Miss Bennett first," Ethan said. Flat, final, the voice of a boy who had spent 3 weeks being the only adult and knew how it felt. Reed nodded. He looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I want to be direct with you. This is winnable. But Caldwell has done this before, and he knows exactly how long an ordinary family can hold on before exhaustion sets in. His strategy will be to make this as draining as possible and wait for you to decide it's not worth it. Clara folded the letter in her hands. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I crossed 800 miles on a train to marry a man I'd never met because I believed in the possibility of a future worth having. I arrived here to find he was gone, and 7 children were in this house alone." She set the letter on the table. "Victor Caldwell has no idea how long I can hold on." A silence. Reed picked up his hat. "No," he said. "I don't think he does." Victor Caldwell arrived in Willow Creek on a Wednesday 4 days after the second letter. Clara was in the kitchen garden when the hired man came to the gate, a smooth-faced young man in a good coat who introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell's assistant, a Mr. Briggs, and who asked with great courtesy whether Miss Bennet might have a few moments to speak with Mr. Caldwell at the hotel in town, at her earliest convenience. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Tell Mr. Caldwell," she said pleasantly, "that if he'd like to discuss the Whitaker property, he can correspond through our legal representative, Thomas Reed. I'm sure Mr. Reed will be glad to arrange a meeting at a time convenient to everyone." Briggs blinked. "Mr. Caldwell was hoping for a more direct conversation," he said. "I'm sure he was," Clara said. She went back to the garden. Briggs stood at the gate for another moment, clearly recalibrating. Then he left. Clara kept her back straight until she heard the horse leave the road. Then she let out a slow breath and pressed both hands flat against the dirt for a moment, feeling the cold earth against her palms. She had bought them time. That was what she told herself. Every day she held this family together and this land intact was another day. Thomas Reed had to find what he was looking for in Denver, but she was frightened. She would not tell any of the children that, and she would not show it, but in the privacy of her own chest, at 2 in the morning, when she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house and the land and the enormous dark, she was frightened. She was frightened because she knew what men like Victor Caldwell were capable of. And she knew that legal battles in territories where he had influence could be shaped in ways that had nothing to do with what was actually right. And she knew that if this family lost the ranch, they would scatter. Ethan would work somewhere for wages. Lydia would go into service and the younger ones. She stopped herself there every time. She stopped herself by getting up. She took to going downstairs at 2 in the morning and sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and working through the accounts, or mending, or writing letters to Reed, or simply sitting with her hands around a cup of cooling coffee, doing the mental work of holding the shape of what she was building. It was on one of those nights that Lydia found her. The girl appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2:30 in a nightgown, her dark hair loose, and looked at Clara with an expression that was different from anything Lydia had shown her before. Not the crossed arms armor, not the challenge. Something younger and more honest. "You can't sleep either," Lydia said. "Not always," Clara said. "Sit down. I'll heat some milk." Lydia sat. Clara heated milk and poured it and set a cup in front of her, and for a few minutes they sat together in the quiet kitchen without speaking. "I know about the letter," Lydia said finally. "The second one. I saw Ethan's face when Reed was here." Clara looked at her. "I didn't hide it from you to protect you," she said. "I need you to know that. I hid it because I was still sorting out how to handle it." "And have you sorted it out?" "Mostly." Lydia wrapped both hands around her cup. "When Pa was sick," she said, "he didn't tell anyone. He thought if he kept working and didn't make a fuss, it would go away. And by the time we knew it was—" She stopped. "Ethan is like that. He carries things alone until they break him." "I know," Clara said. "I do it too," Lydia said. It cost her something to say it. "I learned it from them both." "You do," Clara agreed. "But you're sitting here telling me. That's different." Lydia looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Why are you really staying?" she said. "And don't tell me it's because we need someone. I know we need someone. I want to know why it's you." Clara thought about that for a moment. "Because when I looked at all of you on that porch," she said, "I recognized something. That particular way of holding yourself when you've been let down enough times that you stop expecting to be caught." She paused. "I've stood on that porch. Not this one, but one like it. And I know what it means when someone walks away again. I wasn't going to be one more person who did that. Lydia was quiet. My mother died when I was 9, she said. Pa was good about it. He did everything he could. But there's something... She stopped again. There's something that only a woman knows how to do, for other women. I don't know how to say it exactly. You don't have to say it exactly, Clara said. I understand. Lydia looked at her cup. I still don't completely trust you, she said. I know. But I think... A long pause. I think I believe you mean what you say. That's enough for now, Clara said. That's more than enough. They sat together until the lamp burnt. Two people separated by 16 years and everything they'd each had to learn the hard way. Drinking warm milk in the quiet kitchen of a house that was slowly, painfully, imperfectly becoming a home. The next week, Caldwell moved harder. A third letter arrived from his legal firm in Denver. This one more formal citing specific sections of territorial land code and requesting a formal response within 30 days regarding the survey discrepancy. Alongside it came a separate letter, addressed not to the estate, but to Ethan Whitaker specifically, which Caldwell's firm clearly believed was the family's legal decision-maker. That letter offered a settlement. A cash payment described as generous for the disputed acreage along the river enough. The letter noted with careful sympathy to ensure that the children of James Whitaker were provided for through difficult times. Ethan read it once. Then he put it in the stove. Clara watched the paper catch. That's evidence, she said. I know, Ethan said. But if I look at it one more second, I'm going to say something Lydia would make me apologize for. Fair enough, Clara said. She'd written a summary from memory before he burned it and sent it to Reed that afternoon. Reed wrote back 3 days later with news that tightened something in Clara's chest, though not in the way she feared. He had found something. In the Denver Land Office records, under a surveyor named Robert Harlow, there was a pattern. 4 properties surveyed over a span of 8 years, all in areas later acquired by Caldwell Land and Property. In 3 of those cases, the survey had been used to raise questions about boundary documentation. In 2 of those 3, the families had settled. 1 had fought and lost, though Reed's letter noted pointedly that the judge in that case had 2 years later accepted a political appointment through channels that led back to connections Caldwell maintained with the territorial administration. The 4th property was the Whitaker Ranch. Harlow had done his work in 1872. Caldwell had been patient for 4 years. And now James Whitaker was dead, and the property was occupied by a woman from Ohio who was by every external measure the weakest possible obstacle Victor Caldwell could have hoped to find in his path. That was what he believed. Clara folded Thomas Reed's letter and held it in both hands for a moment, and something happened in her chest that was not fear and not quite anger, but something older and steadier than both. She had been cataloging grievances for weeks for herself. Yes, but more importantly for this family, for James Whitaker, who had built something real and died before he could protect it for 7 children who had already lost everything and were now being positioned to lose the last thing they had left. She had been patient. She had been steady. She had held the line quietly. She was done being quiet. She sent word to Margaret Haynes and to Harlan Cole and to the Delacroix family. She asked them to come to the ranch on Saturday afternoon. They came. All of them, and more people she hadn't invited, who had heard through the particular telegraph of small towns that something was happening and decided they wanted to be part of it. 9 adults gathered in the Whitaker kitchen around the long table, while the younger children played in the yard under Ethan's watch, and Clara stood at the head of that table where James Whitaker used to sit and laid out everything she had. The survey, the pattern, the 4 properties, the judges, the letters. She did not perform distress. She did not appeal to pity. She put the facts on the table the way you put tools on a workbench, clearly, usefully, with the understanding that everyone in the room was capable of seeing what they meant. When she was done, the kitchen was silent for a moment. Then Harlan Cole, who had said almost nothing through the whole presentation, leaned forward with his large hands flat on the table. "What do you need?" he said. "Witnesses," Clara said. "People who know what happened to the Pruitt family. People willing to say in a public proceeding what Victor Caldwell's pattern looks like. People willing to stand in that courtroom and make clear to any judge or official with eyes that this town is watching. Another silence. The Pruitts went to Kansas, Margaret said. But I know where. I can write. I'll go to Denver myself, said the eldest Delacroix, a man in his 60s, who had the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had lived long enough to be finished being afraid. I know a man at the land office who doesn't belong to Caldwell's network. I'll find out if this surveyor's license has ever been formally questioned. One by one, the people around that table offered what they had. Clara looked at each of them. She had arrived in Willow Creek with 2 suitcases and $43. She was beginning to understand that she had arrived with something far more important, the willingness to stay, and that in a town where Victor Caldwell had operated by isolating his targets, a woman who simply refused to be isolated was a problem he had never fully prepared for. Ethan came inside when the guests were leaving and stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the last of them go. "What happened?" he said. Clara started clearing the coffee cups. "The town happened," she said. He looked at the empty table, and the chairs pushed back at angles, and the evidence of 9 people who had been there. "They're going to help," he said. It came out as almost a question. "They're going to help," Clara said. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "When you came here," he said, "I thought you were another person who would leave." He looked at the floor. "I thought Pa had good intentions, but people have good intentions all the time and still leave when it gets hard." Clara set down the cups she was carrying. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "When have I left?" she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. "That's right," she said. She picked the cups back up. "Go check on the little ones. It's getting close to supper time." He stood there one more second. Then he said quietly, "Yes, ma'am," and went. Clara stood in this kitchen with the cups in her hands, and the lamp burning, and the sound of children in the yard coming through the window. And she thought about Victor Caldwell in his hotel in Willow Creek, satisfied and patient, certain that he had done this before, and he knew exactly how it went. She thought about the look on the Delacroix patriarch's face when he'd said he'd go to Denver himself. She thought about Margaret Haynes writing to the Pruitts in Kansas. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd stood in that doorway and finally heard something he'd been afraid to believe. Victor Caldwell was waiting for her to exhaust herself. What he had not accounted for was that Clara Bennett was not fighting alone. She had never in her entire life wanted anything as much as she wanted this family to be safe in their own home. And she was just getting started. The Delacroix patriarch left for Denver on a Monday morning before sunrise. Clara stood in the yard and watched the wagon disappear down the road and felt the particular weight of knowing that the next move belonged to someone else, which was not a feeling she was accustomed to managing well. She turned back to the house and found Ethan standing on the porch with 2 cups of coffee watching her. He held one out. She took it. "How long?" he said. "Reed says 2 weeks for Denver. Maybe less if Delacroix finds what we need quickly." She wrapped both hands around the... "We hold steady until then. And if Caldwell moves before 2 weeks, then we deal with it." Ethan looked at her for a moment with those careful dark eyes. "You're not as sure as you sound," he said. Clara looked back at the road where the Delacroix wagon had gone. "No," she said. "But I'm sure enough. That'll have to do." They drank their coffee standing on the porch in the cold morning air, and neither of them said anything else, and that silence was a different quality than the silences of those first days, less distance in it, more weight shared. Victor Caldwell did not wait 2 weeks. He waited 4 days. On Friday morning, a man arrived at the ranch on horseback, not Briggs, this time, not the smooth-faced assistant. This man was older, harder, with a badge pinned to his coat that identified him as a deputy from the county seat, and an expression that had clearly been arranged to suggest neutrality, but didn't quite get there. Clara met him at the gate. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'm Deputy Marsh out of Fort Collins. I have a notice here from the Territorial Land Office regarding the status of the Whitaker property." He held out a folded document. Clara took it without flinching. She unfolded it and read it completely before she responded, because she had learned long ago that the first moment of receiving bad news was the moment when composed people and panicked people separated, and she was going to be composed if it killed her. The notice declared that pending resolution of the boundary survey dispute, the property's legal status was under formal review by the Territorial Land Office, and that during the period of review, any sale transfer or major modification of the property would require prior approval from the Land Office. It was not an eviction notice. It was not a seizure. It was something more sophisticated and more cruel than either. It was a freeze, a legal limbo designed to make the property impossible to leverage, impossible to borrow against, impossible to use as collateral for anything. While the investigation dragged on for however many months, Caldwell chose to make it drag. Clara refolded the document along its original lines. "Deputy Marsh," she said, "are you aware of the pattern of fraudulent surveys conducted by Robert Harlow, who has a documented financial relationship with Caldwell Land and Property, and who conducted this property's boundary survey in 1872? Marsh blinked. "Ma'am, I'm just delivering. Are you aware?" Clara continued with the same pleasant tone that this same surveyor was involved in the disputed documentation for at least 3 other properties later acquired by Caldwell Land and Property, and that one of those disputes was adjudicated by a judge who subsequently received a political appointment through channels connected to Victor Caldwell's network. Marsh had stopped talking entirely. "Because our legal representative, Mr. Thomas Reed of Willow Creek, has compiled a detailed record of that pattern, which has been filed with the county clerk and copied to 2 separate newspaper editors in Denver." She held out the notice. "Please return this to whoever sent it with the message that we will be responding through our legal representation, and that we are confident the full record will be of considerable interest to the territorial authorities." Marsh took the paper back slowly. He looked at her for a long moment. "You said newspapers," he said. "I did," Clara said. He folded the notice and put it inside his coat. "Good day, Miss Bennett," he said. He turned his horse and rode back down the road at a pace slightly faster than he'd arrived. Clara stood at the gate until he was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. She had not in fact sent anything to any newspaper editors. Thomas Reed had suggested it as a future option, and she had filed it in the back of her mind and deployed it this morning with the complete confidence of a woman who had no other card to play. She would send those letters today. She sent them. The response from Caldwell came not through legal channels, but through the town itself, which was how she knew she had frightened him. Within 3 days of Deputy Marsh's visit, stories began circulating in Willow Creek. Not official statement. Nothing that could be traced to a source. Nothing written down. The invisible, untraceable kind of story that spreads through whispers and implication. The kind designed not to accuse, but to erode. People began suggesting to each other at the general store after church at the saloon that it was a shame about those Whitaker children, all that uncertainty. And wasn't it true that the woman from Ohio had come out there under something of a false pretense, that she'd arrived expecting to marry into property she hadn't earned? That her legal challenges were less about protecting the children and more about protecting her own position. Clara heard about it from Margaret Haynes, who came to the ranch specifically to tell her with the direct efficiency of a woman who believed in putting unpleasant things plainly. "He's trying to turn the town against you," Margaret said. "Not all of it, just enough to make people hesitant to stand beside you publicly." "Is it working?" Clara asked. Margaret considered the question with more honesty than Clara had expected. "Some," she said. "There are people who are waiting to see which way this goes before they commit. That's just human nature, and you shouldn't be surprised by it." "I'm not surprised," Clara said. "I'm disappointed, but not surprised." "The people who matter are still with you," Margaret said. "The ones who've known Caldwell longest." Clara nodded. "Has anything come from the Pruitts?" she asked. Margaret's expression changed, something opening up in it. "I got a letter yesterday," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt is willing to write a sworn statement. She says their survey was conducted by the same man, and that they were told by Caldwell's representative that if they fought it, they would lose the children too, that the court would determine an unsettled property dispute made them unfit guardians." Clara's hands stilled on the table. "He threatened to take their children," she said. "Yes." The silence in the kitchen was very loud. "He might do the same here," Clara said. "He might," Margaret said. I wanted you to know before he tried. Clara sat with that information for the rest of the day. She turned it over and looked at it from every angle, the way you examine something that might be a weapon, so you can understand exactly what it is before it's used against you. The threat to the Pruitts had worked. They'd left. They'd taken their children and run, because when someone threatens to separate you from your children, the rational fear overwhelms everything else. But the Pruitts had been the parents. They had biological legal standing that could be questioned. Clara was something else entirely. She was the woman who had stayed. She had no legal claim. She had no official guardianship. She had no document that put her name beside these 7 children in any formal way. That was the weakness Caldwell was moving toward. She was certain of it now. She went to Thomas Reed the next morning. She sat across from his desk and said, "I need to establish legal guardianship of the Whitaker children, formally, on paper, whatever that requires." Reed removed his spectacles and set them on the desk. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "formal guardianship in the territory requires a court proceeding. It requires demonstrating that the guardian is fit, that the children have no closer relative capable of assuming responsibility, and it requires the consent of the eldest child if that child is above a certain age. Ethan is 15. Then his consent matters." "He'll give it," Clara said. She didn't say it with bravado. She said it the way you state a fact you are certain of, because you have earned the right to be certain. Reed looked at her. "There's something else," he said. "If we file for guardianship and Caldwell's people are watching the court records, which they are, it will signal to him that you're moving to formalize your position. He may accelerate his timeline." "He's already accelerating," Clara said. "He sent a deputy with a land freeze notice. He's spreading stories in town. He threatened to take the Pruitt children." She put her hands flat on the desk. "Mr. Reed, he is coming. The question is whether I am standing in a legal position when he arrives, or whether I am standing in nothing." A long pause. "File the guardianship petition," Reed said. "Today," Clara said. "Today," Reed agreed. She was halfway out the door when he said, "Miss Bennett." She turned. "You should know," he said. "There is one judge in this district who does not have connections to Caldwell. Judge Arthur Hale. He's old, he's slow, and he's stubborn as a post. But he is clean. I will file specifically for his docket." Clara nodded. "Thank you," she said. She rode home and went directly to the barn where Ethan was working, which was where he always was when he needed to think and move at the same time. How was reinforcing a stall door with new timber. The kind of focused physical work that gave his hands something to do while his mind ran. He looked up when she came in. "Something happened," he said. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Sit down." He set down the hammer. She told him everything. The Pruitt letter. Caldwell's threat to take the children, the guardianship petition, Thomas Reed's plan. Ethan listened without interrupting. His face was very still. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. "He would actually do that," Ethan said. "Try to take Lucy and Benjamin and—" "It's a pressure tactic first," Clara said. "It worked on the Pruitts because they ran before he could follow through. We are not running." "No," Ethan said immediately, hard and certain. "But I need to make my position legal," Clara said. "Guardianship. Your consent matters, the court requires it. I'm not asking you to call me anything you don't want to call me, or to give me any authority you're not comfortable with. I'm asking you to let me stand in a legal position between Caldwell and your family." Ethan looked at his hands. "What happens if the court says no?" he said. "Then we fight with what we have," Clara said. "But I'd rather fight from solid ground." Howe was quiet again. "Miss Bennett," he said. He stopped. He tried again. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and they both heard it. "My father wrote to you for 6 months. He told me things about those letters. He said—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "He said he thought you were the kind of woman who understood that a family is something you build, not something you're handed." He looked up. He was right. Clara felt something press hard against the back of her eyes and kept it there. "Give me your consent, Ethan," she said quietly. "You have it," he said. You've had it for a while. I just needed to say it out loud." The guardianship petition was filed the following Monday on Judge Arthur Hale's docket. By Wednesday, Caldwell knew about it. By Thursday, his legal firm in Denver had filed a counter-motion arguing that Clara Bennett had no legitimate relationship to the Whitaker family, had arrived in Willow Creek under circumstances that did not constitute valid family formation, and that the court should appoint a male guardian from the nearest suitable relative, a cousin of James's, apparently, who lived in Kansas, and whom Ethan later told Clara he had met exactly once at age 6, and remembered as a man who smelled like whiskey and complained about the food. "He's a stranger," Ethan said. "Caldwell doesn't want a guardian who'll protect the family," Clara said. "He wants a guardian he can manage." The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks in which Victor Caldwell apparently decided that patience was no longer his primary strategy. On a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the hearing, someone cut the fence line on the east side of the property, the side nearest the river, the disputed boundary land. The cattle that had been grazing there were gone by morning. Not stolen, they'd simply wandered through the gap and dispersed across the open range, which meant they weren't legally gone, but practically gone because rounding up scattered cattle in that terrain without help was days of work. Ethan discovered it at dawn and came back to the house with his jaw set and both hands in fists. Clara looked at his face. "How many?" she said. 14 head, he said. "Maybe more. It's hard to tell until we search." "Can you round them up?" "Not alone, not in less than a week." She put on her coat. "Then we ask for help," she said. They rode to the Delacroix farm. Old Henri. Delacroix had been back from Denver for 2 days and hadn't yet had the chance to deliver his findings to Reed, which he did that morning over Clara's kitchen table with a weathered leather folder of documents and the unhurried satisfaction of a man who had found what he went looking for. Robert Harlow's surveyor's license had been issued in 1868, under the sponsorship of a land company that was Henri had discovered through 2 days of patient record searching, a subsidiary company of what had eventually become Caldwell Land and Property. His surveys were not independent professional work. They were and had been from the beginning instruments of Caldwell's acquisition strategy. The documents were dated. They were official. They were, Thomas Reed said when Henri laid them before him, the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. "This is not a boundary dispute," Reed said. "This is fraud. Systematic, documented fraud." "Can you bring it before Judge Hale?" Clara asked. "I can do better than that," Reed said. "I can bring it to the Territorial Attorney's Office and request that the land freeze notice be withdrawn pending a criminal fraud investigation." "Will they move on that?" "With this documentation." Reed held up the folder. "They'll have to." Clara exhaled. But there were still 14 cattle somewhere on the open range, and winter was 6 weeks out, and those animals represented money this family could not afford to lose. Harlan Cole showed up at the ranch that afternoon with 2 of his former deputies and the Delacroix's 2 youngest sons, who were built like furniture and knew the range as well as anyone in the territory. They spent 2.5 days rounding up the cattle. They brought them back in groups, the way you return things that were taken deliberately without rush, with the specific dignity of people demonstrating that they will not be diminished. Clara fed all of them. Every single day. She cooked for 12 people without comment and without performance and without asking anything from anyone. And on the last evening when the final cattle were back in the repaired fencing, Harlan Cole sat at the long kitchen table and ate the meal she set before him and said, "Miss Bennett, I rode with 3 sheriffs in 20 years. I've known a lot of people who said the right things about standing for what's right." He paused. "You're one of the few I've seen who just does it without saying anything at all." Clara set down the bread basket. "My mother told me," she said, "that the way you know a person is real is that they're the same when nobody's watching. I'm just trying to be the same." Cole nodded slowly. "Caldwell's going to push harder before the hearing," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she said. He leaned forward. "There are people in this town who have wanted to push back against him for years," he said. "They've been waiting for someone to go first. You went first." He paused. "You'll have more people at that hearing than you expect." Clara looked at him. "Are you one of them?" she asked. "I'll be in the front row," he said. She was back at the house cleaning up after the meal when she heard small feet on the stairs and turned to find Benjamin standing in the kitchen doorway. He was holding his shoes, which meant he'd come down specifically, rather than wandering. He'd put intention into this. "I want to help," he said. Clara looked at him. "The cattle roundup," he said. "I know I'm 5 and I know everyone said stay inside, but I can do things. I can count. I counted the cattle that came back each day from the window. I kept the number." Clara crouched down to his level. "You kept the number," she said. He held up a small piece of paper covered in careful large tally marks. "So we'd know if Harlan's men got them all," he said, "in case they lost track." Clara looked at the tally marks. They were accurate. She knew because she'd been keeping the same count. "Benjamin," she said, "that is exactly the kind of help we needed, and you did it perfectly." He stood a little taller. "Okay," he said, like he'd been waiting to hear that one thing. She tucked him back into bed 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway of the room where he and Samuel slept. Both of them now breathing the slow rhythms of sleep, and she thought about Victor Caldwell in his hotel, or his Denver office, or wherever he was tonight, calculating his next move. And she thought about what it would mean for this boy. This small, careful, quietly brave boy, who counted cattle from a window to make himself useful. If Caldwell's plan succeeded and a stranger from Kansas arrived to take over their guardianship. She went back downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote letters until midnight. To the Denver newspaper, to the territorial attorney, to the Pruitt family in Kansas, asking if Mrs. Pruitt would be willing to travel to Willow Creek for the hearing. To 3 other families she had identified through Margaret's network who had had land dealings with Caldwell and whose stories formed part of the same pattern. She sealed each letter and stacked them and would send them in the morning. She was blowing out the lamp when she heard someone in the doorway and turned. It was Lydia. Not in her nightgown this time, fully dressed, which meant she'd been awake and waiting. "I was listening," Lydia said. There was no apology in it. "I know," Clara said. "The hearing is 3 weeks away." "Yes." "Caldwell has a judge he can reach." "Not this judge," Clara said. "That's why Reed filed specifically for Hale. But Caldwell has money and lawyers and connections, and we have—" Lydia stopped. "We have the truth," Clara said. "We have documentation of fraud. We have witnesses. We have a town that is watching." She paused. "We have each other." Lydia stood there for a moment. "That sounds like something from a sermon," she said. "Maybe," Clara said. "But I also mean it exactly." Lydia looked at the stack of sealed letters on the table. "I want to come to the hearing," she said. "I was going to ask you to," Clara said. "Ethan will come. But I want to come too. I want him to see us." She didn't say Caldwell's name. She didn't need to. "I want him to look at this family and see what he's up against." Clara looked at this girl, this fierce, difficult, armor-wearing 13-year-old girl who had kept 6 children alive on her own for 3 weeks, and who still didn't quite trust the world, but was learning day by day to trust one person in it. "Lydia," she said, "the morning of the hearing, you will sit beside me in that courtroom, and he will see exactly what he's up against." Lydia's chin came up. "Good," she said. She went back upstairs. Clara stood in the dark kitchen for a moment longer. Then she picked up her letters and went to bed. 2 weeks before the hearing, Victor Caldwell made his worst mistake. He came to the ranch himself. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a good carriage with 2 men riding alongside, not Briggs, not deputies. The 2 men had the particular posture of people hired for purposes that didn't require introducing themselves. Caldwell himself stepped down from the carriage with the ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being received. He was a large man, carefully dressed, the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 30 and had hardened into something more commanding at 50. He had the manner of someone who had won so many negotiations that he no longer thought of them as negotiations at all. He thought of them as announcements. Clara was standing on the porch when the carriage came up the drive because she had been watching the road for 3 days. She had known with the specific certainty of someone who has been tracking a pattern that he would come in person when the legal strategies stopped producing results. Personal intimidation was always the next step. She did not go down to meet him. She waited on the porch. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her with an expression that was almost amused. "Miss Bennet," he said, "I appreciate finally having the opportunity to speak directly." "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I think if we could have a frank conversation," he said, "we might be able to resolve this situation in a way that is beneficial to everyone, particularly to these children." "Then speak frankly," she said. He adjusted his coat. "You came here to start a life," he said. "I understand that, and I understand that circumstances did not develop as you anticipated. You've shown admirable character in remaining, and no one disputes that you have done good work with this family." He paused, letting the generosity of the statement settle. "But the legal reality is that this property has a documentation problem that will take years to fully resolve, and those years will be hard on a family already in difficult straits. I am prepared to offer a settlement that would provide these children with financial security. Real security. Enough to establish each of them when they come of age." Clara looked at him. "How much?" she said. He named a figure. It was substantial. She felt the pull of it, not for herself, but because she had been living on $43 going on 2 months, and she knew exactly how much this family needed. She understood in her bones why the Pruitts had taken the settlement. "And the ranch," she said, "would be acquired by our company," he said, "at a fair price that reflects the value of the undisputed acreage." "At your assessment of fair," she said. "At a market assessed, Mr. Caldwell." She stepped forward to the edge of the porch. "This ranch is where these children's parents are buried. This land is what their father built with his hands over 20 years. This property is the only thing standing between 7 children and the world deciding they don't belong anywhere." She looked at him steadily. "There is no number." The almost amusement faded from his face. "Miss Bennet," he said, "I want to be honest with you. The guardianship petition is unlikely to succeed for a woman in your position. The court tends to favor family." "The hearing is before Judge Hale," she said. "I think we both know what that means." A small silence. Something moved in his expression. Not quite anger, more like recalculation. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I know," she said. "I intend to keep doing that." He looked at her for a long moment. "This family will regret the difficulty you're choosing for them," he said. Quiet now, the amusement entirely gone. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "the last time someone told me I would regret not taking what they were offering, they were wrong. I have not been in the habit of regret." She looked at his 2 men and then back at him. "You should leave my property now." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned, walked back to the carriage and left. Clara did not move from the porch until the carriage was fully out of sight. Then she sat down on the top porch step because her legs had decided they were done standing, and pressed her hands between her knees and breathed. She heard the door open behind her. Ethan sat down beside her on the step. He'd been inside. He'd heard everything. "You called it your property," he said. Clara looked out at the road. "I know," she said. "I shouldn't have—" "No," Ethan said. "I'm glad you did." I was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to stop," Ethan said. "No," Clara said. "He's not." "So what do we do?" Clara looked at the road Caldwell's carriage had taken. She thought about Henri Delacroix's folder of documents. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt in Kansas writing a sworn statement. She thought about Harlan Cole saying he'd be in the front row. She thought about Lydia saying she wanted Caldwell to see what he was up against. She thought about a little girl in a kitchen doorway who had crossed the room in the dark and pressed herself against the side of a woman from Ohio and learned finally that she was not going to disappear. "We walk into that courtroom," Clara said, "and we show him exactly what he's been trying to take apart." Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. "I'm sorry I made it hard for you," he said. "In the beginning." "You were protecting your family," she said. "I was scared," he said. "Same thing." "Yes," Clara said. "Usually is." They sat on the porch together in the falling light. And behind them, The house was quiet, in the way it had learned to be quiet. Not the desperate held breath quiet of before, but the quiet of a place where people felt safe enough to rest. 10 days before the hearing, a letter arrived from the territorial attorney's office. Reed brought it personally. He sat at the kitchen table with Clara and Ethan and Lydia. Lydia had simply sat down without being asked, and nobody told her to leave, and he opened the letter and read. The territorial attorney had reviewed the documentation regarding Robert Harlow's surveyor's license and his financial relationship with Caldwell Land and Properties' predecessor company. A preliminary investigation had been opened. The land freeze notice issued against the Whitaker property had been suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. The land freeze was gone. Ethan made a sound that was not quite a word. Lydia pressed her knuckles against her mouth. Clara sat completely still. "It's not over," Reed said immediately. "The guardianship hearing still proceeds. Caldwell's legal challenge to that is still active. The fraud investigation could take months." He paused. "But the freeze is gone. The property's status is no longer in formal limbo. When we walk into that courtroom next week, we walk in with clean land documentation." Clara looked at the letter. "He's going to come at us harder now," she said. "Yes," Reed said. "He will. Then we need to be ready." She was ready. She had been ready since the morning she picked up 2 suitcases on a train platform in Willow Creek, Colorado, and asked a 15-year-old boy how many children were waiting at home. She had been ready, if she was being completely honest with herself, since she was a girl standing inside the broken places of her own life, and deciding that she was not going to let those places make her into someone who gave up. 7 days before the hearing, Lydia came to her room after the younger children were in bed. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to know something." Clara set down her book. "That first night," Lydia said, "when you made supper, I thought you were performing. I thought you were showing us what a good, capable woman you were, so we'd let you stay." "I know," Clara said, "but then I watched you." Lydia's voice was careful, precise. She was choosing each word. "You didn't change when you thought nobody was watching. You got up at 2 in the morning and worked when there was nothing to prove to anyone. You sat with Benjamin at the window. You listened to Samuel talk about wood for 2 hours like it was the most interesting thing you'd ever heard." She stopped. Clara waited. "You're not performing," Lydia said. "You're just you." "Yes," Clara said. Lydia stood in the doorway. "I don't know what to call you," she said, honest, almost helpless. "I know you're not my mother. I know that. But you're—" "You don't have to call me anything," Clara said. "Not tonight, not ever if you don't want to. What matters is what we are to each other, not what we call it." Lydia stood there a moment longer. Then she walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and leaned her head against Clara's shoulder. Just for a moment. Just long enough for something that had been wound tight inside her for a very long time to finally quietly let go. Clara did not move, did not speak. She simply stayed the way she had promised to stay, the way she intended to keep on staying. Outside the window, the Colorado sky was enormous and cold and full of stars. The hearing was in 6 days, and Victor Caldwell had no idea what was walking into that courtroom to face him. The morning of the hearing, Clara was up before the sun. She dressed in the dark, moving quietly so as not to wake anyone, and went downstairs and built up the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around an empty cup waiting for it to brew. Watching the sky go from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a Colorado morning that had decided to cooperate. She was not calm. She was the thing on the other side of calm. The place past fear, where the body runs on something cleaner and colder, where every sense is sharp and every thought lands precisely. She had been here before in smaller ways, at smaller junctures. She knew how to use it. Ethan came down at 5:30. He was already dressed, already wearing his good coat, the one she'd seen hanging on the peg by the door since her first week here, and had never seen him put on until now. He looked older in it. He looked for a moment like someone she thought she recognized. He looked like his father's letters. He poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window. "How do you feel?" he said. Like I want this to be over, she said. That's honest. I find honesty useful before court hearings, she said. He almost smiled. They heard Lydia on the stairs. Quick, purposeful footsteps, none of the reluctance of someone not wanting to be there. She appeared in the kitchen, already dressed, her dark hair pinned back, wearing the blue dress she'd worn to her father's burial and hadn't put on since. She looked at Clara, and Clara looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't require language. "The little ones?" Clara asked. "Samuel said he'd get them fed," Lydia said. "Margaret Haynes is coming at 8 to stay with Lucy and Benjamin and the twins while we're in town." Clara nodded. Benjamin had taken the news that he wasn't coming to the hearing with the specific stoicism of a 5-year-old who is trying very hard to be older than he is. He'd pressed his lips together and said, "Okay," and then quietly asked if Clara thought it would be all right. "Yes," she'd said. "I think it's going to be all right." He'd looked at her for a long moment, with James Whittaker's dark eyes. "You've been right about things before," he said very seriously. "I have," she said. "Okay," he said again, and went to find Samuel. Margaret Haynes arrived at 10 minutes to 8 with a covered dish and the brisk efficiency of a woman who had organized harder situations than this. She kissed Clara on the cheek, which surprised both of them, and said, "Go win," and took over the kitchen with the authority of someone who had been running her own establishment for 20 years. The road to Willow Creek took 40 minutes by wagon. None of them talked much. Ethan drove. Lydia sat on Clara's left. The morning was cold and bright, and the mountains were very clear on the horizon, the kind of day that made the world look like it had been washed and hung out fresh. And Clara looked at those mountains and thought about James Whittaker writing to a woman in Ohio about a place where the sky was honest, and felt a complex, quiet grief that she had not yet had the proper time to sit with. She would sit with it. After today. Thomas Reed met them at the courthouse door. He was already carrying his leather case, already wearing his court coat. He shook Ethan's hand and nodded to Lydia and looked at Clara. "The Pruitt letter arrived by Ryder yesterday evening," he said. "I have it. I also have 3 signed statements from former neighbors of properties Caldwell acquired, all documenting the same pattern of survey manipulation and legal pressure." "What about Caldwell's attorney?" Clara asked. "A man named Forsyth. He's good and he's expensive, and he argues the way people argue when they're being paid to argue regardless of what's true." Reed paused. "But he's arguing on a foundation that is now significantly compromised by the fraud documentation." He held up the leather case. "We have more than he does. What I cannot predict is how Judge Hale will weigh the guardianship question specifically, because that is a matter of judicial discretion." "Judge Hale," Clara said. "Tell me about him." Reed considered the question. "He has been on the territorial bench for 19 years. He buried a wife, raised 3 children, largely alone, and is known to have particular impatience for men who use legal mechanisms to bully people who can't easily defend themselves." Reed paused. "He also believes as a matter of principle that a child's best interest is the only question that should be answered in a guardianship proceeding." Clara absorbed that. "Then let him answer it," she said. They went in. The courtroom was a plain, wooden benches, high windows, a judge's bench at the front, elevated by 3 steps that gave it the feeling of a pulpit. Caldwell's attorney was already at the defendant's table, a compact man in a very good suit who arranged his papers with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected to have room to spread out. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table with Reed. Ethan and Lydia took the bench directly behind her. And then Clara turned and saw who else was in the room. Harlan Cole was in the front row, as promised. Beside him, the eldest Delacroix Henri, with his folder of documents. Margaret had clearly sent word to people before she came to watch the children, because the Delacroix sons were there, both of them, and the preacher, Reverend Hartwell, and 4 other families from the valley, Clara recognized from church and from the Saturday meeting at the ranch. The Pruitt statement had been read by more than Reed she understood, because there was a woman in the 3rd row that Clara didn't know who had her hands clasped tightly in her lap and her jaw set, and Margaret had written that Mrs. Pruitt's sister lived in Fort Collins. The room was not full, but it was full enough. Caldwell was there too. He sat in the row behind his attorney's table, and he looked the same as he'd looked on the ranch porch, large, composed, certain of outcomes. He looked at Clara once when she came in. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was necessary to communicate that she was not going to look away first, and then she turned to her table. Judge Arthur Hale entered the room, and everyone rose. He was older than Clara had pictured. 70, perhaps. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned to conserve energy without losing authority. He had white hair and a face that had been weathered by 19 years of other people's difficulties, and his eyes behind their thick glasses were a pale gray that missed nothing. He sat. They sat. He looked at his papers. He looked up. "This proceeding concerns two matters," he said. His voice was dry and clear. First, the guardianship petition filed by Miss Clara Bennett regarding the minor children of the late James Whittaker. Second, the countermotion filed by Caldwell Land and Properties Legal Representation, challenging the validity of said petition. He looked over the top of his glasses at the room. "We will proceed in that order. Mr. Reed, you may begin." Reed stood. He was not a dramatic man. He did not perform. He laid out the case the way he laid out everything, clearly in order, without embellishment, trusting the facts to carry their own weight. He described Clara's arrival, her decision to remain, the weeks of care she had provided. He described the legal steps she had taken to secure the family's position. He described the children's situation and their needs, and Ethan's formal consent. Then he described Victor Caldwell. He did it without heat. He laid out the surveyor's license documentation and its connection to Caldwell's predecessor company. He laid out the pattern of 4 properties, the disputed surveys, the acquisitions. He read Mrs. Pruitt's sworn statement, which described in plain, direct language exactly what Caldwell's representatives had said to her and her husband about the risk of losing their children if they fought. The courtroom was very quiet while Reed read that statement. Forsyth objected twice. Hale sustained neither objection. When Reed sat down, Forsyth stood. How was good. Clara had been warned, and she had believed the warning, but hearing it in practice was different. He was precise and strategic, and he argued the guardianship question the way it was most vulnerable, not on Clara's character, but on her legal standing. She had no biological connection to these children. She had no prior relationship to the family. She had arrived under circumstances that the territory's courts had no precedent for classifying as valid family formation. "Whatever goodwill Miss Bennett has shown this family," Forsyth said, "the question before this court is a legal one, and the law requires more than goodwill." He argued for the Kansas cousin, a Mr. Arthur Whittaker, as the appropriate guardian on the grounds of blood relation. Then Forsyth made a mistake. He said, "Furthermore, Your Honor, it is the position of my client that the minor children's best interests are served by stability in legal guardianship, and that the instability created by Miss Bennett's uncertain position, an unmarried woman with no property, no family connection, no established residence in this territory, represents precisely the kind of instability that territorial law was designed to prevent." The courtroom was quiet. Judge Hale looked over his glasses at Forsyth. "Counselor," he said, "let me be certain I understand your argument. You are suggesting that a woman who has spent the past several weeks feeding, housing, educating, protecting, and legally advocating for 7 orphaned children represents instability." "Your Honor, the legal definition of—" "I read the law," Hale said, flat and final. "Sit down, Mr. Forsyth." Forsyth sat. Something shifted in the room. Clara felt it, the particular shift of a tide that has been running one direction and makes its turn. She kept her face still. Hale looked at his papers for a long moment. "I have a question for the young man." "Man," he said. "Ethan Whittaker." Ethan stood. "Come forward," Hale said. Ethan came forward and stood before the bench, 15 years old, broad-shouldered in his father's good coat, with his hat in his hands, and his eyes level and steady. "You are the eldest child," Hale said. "Yes, sir." "And you have consented to this guardianship petition?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, because he was choosing how to give it. "Because she stayed," he said. "When she had every reason to leave, she stayed. She worked beside us, and she fought for us, and she learned all of us, not just what we needed, but who we are." He paused. My father wrote to her for 6 months. He told me she was the kind of woman who understood that family is something you build. He looked at Hale steadily. He was right. Hale looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down, son," he said. Ethan sat. Hale looked at his papers again. Then he looked up at the room. "Miss Bennet," he said. Clara stood. "You are aware," he said, "that legal guardianship carries significant responsibility and no guaranteed compensation. You are aware that these children will require years of care and that your financial situation is at present considerably strained." "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are aware that the opposing counsel has correctly identified that you have no legal precedent for your position here." "Yes, Your Honor." "Then tell me," Hale said, "why I should grant this petition." Clara stood at the plaintiff's table in the plain wooden courtroom with the high windows and the morning light coming in at an angle, and every person she had met in the past 2 months watching from the benches behind her, and she said, "Because those children are home, and I am the person who made it home. And the law, whatever it says about blood and precedent and formal connection, cannot undo what has already been built between us." She paused. "Arthur Whitaker in Kansas is a stranger. I am not a stranger. I am the woman who sat with Benjamin at the window when he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I am the woman who listened to Samuel talk about wood for 2 hours because his grief lived in his hands and his hands needed to be busy. I am the woman Lydia came to at 2 in the morning when she couldn't carry the weight alone anymore." She stopped. "Your Honor, the law asks what is in the best interest of these children. I am asking it too, and the answer is the same." The courtroom was silent. Then from the bench directly behind Clara, a sound. Small, high, almost inaudible. Clara turned. Lucy was there. Margaret had said she would stay with the children. Clara had agreed. But Lucy was there standing on the bench beside Ethan, having apparently informed Margaret at some point during the morning that she was going full stop, and having been brought by Ethan's youngest sister Rose, who had also come, which meant the twins were both there, and Benjamin was there, his shoes perfectly tied, standing very straight. All 7 children were in that courtroom. Clara stared at them. Ethan looked at her with an expression that said this had not been his plan either, but that he had not been able to stop it, and had frankly not tried very hard. Lucy was looking at Clara with her enormous dark eyes. And then Lucy, 3 years old, and certain pointed at Clara, and said to Judge Hale in her small, clear voice, "That's our ma." The courtroom did not erupt. It went instead very still, the particular stillness of a room full of people who have just heard something that says everything. Judge Hale looked at Lucy for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked down at his papers. He picked up his pen. "The guardianship petition," he said, "is granted." The sound that came from the benches behind Clara was not loud either. It was the sound of people who have been holding their breath, finally exhaling, which is a quieter sound than celebration, but more real. Clara pressed both hands flat on the table. She stood very still. Reed put his hand briefly on her arm. Forsyth was already on his feet. "Your Honor, my client wishes to—" "Your client," Hale said, setting down his pen and looking at Forsyth over his glasses with the particular patience of a man who has run out of it, "will sit down. I am not finished." Forsyth sat. Hale looked at the courtroom. "I am referring the documentation regarding Robert Harlow's surveyor's license and its documented connection to Caldwell land and property to the Territorial Attorney's Office, with a recommendation for formal criminal fraud proceedings." He looked directly at Victor Caldwell. "This court has seen this pattern before and declined to name it. I am naming it today." A pause. "The Whitaker Properties documentation stands as filed. The land freeze notice is hereby permanently voided. The property belongs to the Whitaker family and their legal guardian, Miss Clara Bennet." Caldwell's face had done something during this speech that Clara watched carefully. She had expected anger. She had expected the cold, contained fury of a powerful man being told no. What she saw instead was something older and more interesting, the particular expression of someone who has for the first time fully understood that they have miscalculated. Not the situation, themselves. He had looked at a woman from Ohio with 2 suitcases and seen an obstacle that would eventually exhaust itself. He had not seen what she was building. He stood. He said nothing to his attorney, nothing to Clara, nothing to the room. He walked out. His footsteps on the wooden floor were the only sound until the door closed behind him. Then the room came alive. Harlan Cole was the first one over the bar. He came with his hand extended and shook Clara's hand twice, then Ethan's with the firm, decisive grip of someone sealing something that doesn't need more words. The Delacroix patriarch followed, and then the preacher, and then people. Clara recognized, and people she didn't. All of them moving forward in the particular organized warmth of a community that has been waiting to show its hand. And through all of it, Lucy held onto Clara's sleeve with both fists and did not let go. Benjamin appeared at Clara's elbow at some point during the commotion and stood very close without touching her, which was his way. "Was it all right?" he said. Clara looked down at him. "Yes," she said. "It was all right." He exhaled. "Good," he said. "I counted right." Clara looked at him. "What?" "The people on our side." He held up his small piece of paper. Tally marks neat and careful. "I counted them when we came in. I wanted to know if we had enough." Clara crouched to his level. "How many did we have?" she said. He showed her the paper. She looked at the count. She looked at his face. "Benjamin," she said. "We had more than enough." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "I thought so," he said. "I just wanted to be sure." The drive home was different from the drive into town. The morning's cold had given way to the particular afternoon warmth of October in Colorado, that brief, unreliable warmth that felt like a gift because everyone knew it wouldn't last. The children filled the wagon with a kind of noise Clara hadn't heard from them before, not the careful, managed interactions of people trying to hold a fragile household together, but something looser and louder and more natural. The twins argued about who had been bravest, going into the courtroom uninvited. Samuel, who had also apparently materialized from somewhere without anyone's clear authorization, said that bravery wasn't a competition, which the twins ignored. Benjamin sat beside Clara, with his tally paper in his pocket and a look of settled satisfaction. Lucy slept against Clara's side before they'd gone half a mile, which was her habit and her verdict on any situation she found acceptable. Ethan drove. He said very little, which was also his habit. But at one point on the stretch of road where the mountains came into full view ahead of them, the blue ridge of the Rockies, going rose gold in the afternoon light, he said without turning from the road. "He's going to be held accountable. Caldwell." "Reed thinks so," Clara said. "The fraud investigation. Not just legally." Ethan paused. "People know now. What he did to the Pruitts. What he tried to do to us. People talk in small territories." He paused again. "He can buy lawyers. He can't buy back a reputation." Clara looked at the mountains. "No," she said. "He can't." Another silence. "Miss Bennett," Ethan said. He seemed to be deciding something. "I've been thinking about what to call you." He kept his eyes on the road. "I can't call you Mother. I know that. You know that. And you said we don't need to name what we are." He paused. "But I think I need to call you something." "What were you thinking?" Clara said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said. "If that's all right, just Clara." "That's all right," she said. "It's what Pa called you," he said. "In the letters. Just Clara. Like he already knew you." Clara looked at the road ahead. "He did a little," she said. "And I knew him. Not the way I might have. But enough." Ethan nodded. They drove the rest of the way home in a quiet that was nothing like the silences of those first days. That evening, Margaret Haynes stayed for supper, and the meal was the longest and loudest and most disorganized the Whitaker kitchen had ever produced in Clara's time there. 3 conversations ran simultaneously. The twins recounted the courtroom scene in detail that grew more dramatic with each telling. Samuel showed Henri Delacroix, who had ridden out with them, the cabinet he was building, and the 2 of them disappeared into the barn for 40 minutes while the food got cold and nobody particularly minded. Benjamin ate everything on his plate, including the beans, which Clara noted privately as a measure of the day's significance. Lydia sat across from Clara and said very little during the meal. But at one point, when the table was at its most chaotic, and Ethan was refereeing a disagreement between the twins that had escalated to the level of requiring formal arbitration, Lydia looked across at Clara and said quietly enough that only Clara heard, "He called you Clara." "He did," Clara said. "Good," Lydia said, and went back to her food. After supper, after the children were in bed, after Margaret had gone home, and the kitchen was quiet, and the last lamp was burning low, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the morning she had stepped off the train in Willow Creek with 2 suitcases and $43 and a letter from a man who had already been buried for 3 weeks. She thought about the platform and the heat and the 15-year-old boy with his hat in his hands, telling her his father was gone. She thought about looking into that wagon and deciding without entirely understanding why that she was going to see what was at the end of the road. She thought about the document Thomas Reed had filed that afternoon, officially recording the guardianship grant. She thought about Lucy's voice in the courtroom. "That's our ma." Clara wrapped both hands around the cold cup. She had been so certain when she boarded that westbound train that she was traveling toward something. A husband, a partnership, the possibility of a life she had not yet been able to build on her own. She had arrived at a grave and 7 children and a winter coming, and a man in Denver who wanted everything these children had left. And she had stayed. Not because it was easy. Not because she was certain it would work out. She had stayed because the alternative, picking up her suitcases and walking back to the station and getting on an eastbound train and leaving these 7 children to face Victor Caldwell and winter and grief without anyone, was something she was not constituted to do. She heard small feet on the stairs. She turned. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway. He was still dressed. He'd never changed out of the good coat, she realized. He looked at her sitting at the table with the cold coffee. "Can't sleep," he said. "Not yet," she said. He came and sat across from her. They sat in silence for a while. "I found something today," he said finally. "After we got home. I'd been avoiding Pa's room, and today I went in." He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them. It was a small photograph, edges worn. It had been handled many times. Clara looked at it. A woman, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a direct gaze, and a slight smile that had the quality of someone who smiled only when they meant it. She was beautiful in the specific way of people who don't know or don't think about it. "My mother," Ethan said. Clara looked at it. "She died when Lucy was born," Ethan said. "Lucy never knew her." He paused. "Pa used to say she would have liked someone with backbone. He said she had no patience for people who flinched." Clara looked at the photograph. "She sounds remarkable," she said. She was. Ethan looked at the photograph. "I want Lucy to know about her, about our mother. Not to be confused about things. Not to mix up who is who, but to know." "She should know," Clara said. "Will you help?" he said. "You didn't know her, but the way Pa wrote about family, I think he'd want someone to help us remember out loud." Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I'll help." He nodded. He picked the photograph back up and looked at it for a moment. "Pa made a good choice," he said. It came out quietly, like he'd been thinking it for a while and had finally found the moment. "Your father," Clara said carefully, "was a very wise man." Ethan put the photograph back in his pocket. He stood and pushed in the chair. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Ethan," she said. He went upstairs. Clara sat alone in the quiet kitchen and let the day come apart in her hands and let the relief finally arrive fully and completely, the way it only can when you've been holding it back for weeks. She did not cry. She sat with it, the way she had learned to sit with hard things and let it be what it was. The end of something frightening and the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. The photograph of the woman with the direct gaze was upstairs in Ethan's pocket. The document with Clara's name on it was filed in Thomas Reed's office. Lucy's voice was still in the courtroom in Clara's memory, clear as a bell, pointing with both the certainty of someone who has decided and the simplicity of someone who sees no reason to complicate what is true. "That's our ma." The lamp burned low. Clara got up, banked the fire for the night, and went upstairs to her small room. The room that was no longer small. The room that was hers. Winter came to Willow Creek the way it always did, without apology and ahead of schedule. The first snow arrived 3 days after the hearing, and Clara stood at the kitchen window at 5 in the morning, watching it come down, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief exactly. Not happiness exactly. Something older and quieter than both. The particular feeling of a person who has walked a very long road and arrived somewhere real. She turned from the window and started the fire. By the time the coffee was ready, Ethan was down. By the time the eggs were on, Samuel was in the barn. By the time the bread was out of the oven, Lucy was pressed against Clara's left side with her eyes still mostly closed, swaying slightly with the specific boneless trust of a child who has decided that wherever this person is standing is a safe place to be half asleep. This was the morning. Every morning now. Clara set her hand briefly on Lucy's hair and went back to the eggs. The fraud investigation into Victor Caldwell moved through the territorial courts over the following months with the slow grinding authority of a system that had finally decided to take something seriously. Thomas Reed sent updates every 2 weeks. The picture that emerged from the formal proceedings was worse than even Clara had known. Not 4 properties, but 7, stretching back 14 years. A network of surveyors and county officials, and at least 2 territorial judges who had received payments that the investigation was now characterizing very specifically and very publicly. Caldwell himself had left Colorado by December. Nobody in Willow Creek knew exactly where he'd gone, and nobody spent much energy wondering. Margaret Haynes said he'd gone to California. Harlan Cole said it didn't matter where he'd gone as long as it was gone. Clara agreed with Harlan Cole. The ranch settled into winter with the purposeful rhythm of people who have learned to work together. Ethan managed the livestock and the fencing and the heavy outdoor work with a competence that made Clara understand daily how much he had been carrying alone in those first weeks before she arrived. She stopped being surprised by him. She started being proud of him, which was a different thing, and she could see that he felt the difference even when neither of them named it. Samuel built things. He built the cellar shelf properly with cedar exactly as he'd planned, and then he built a new work table for the barn, and a small cabinet for the twins' room, and a set of shelves for the kitchen that were so well joined they didn't creak even in the cold. Henri Delacroix came by one afternoon and looked at the shelves and said in the particular understated way of men who know their craft, "That boy has a gift." Clara said, "I know." And she sent Samuel to spend Saturday mornings at the Delacroix farm, where Henri had a proper woodworking shop and opinions about joinery that Samuel absorbed with the focused hunger of someone who has finally found the language he was meant to speak. Samuel came home from the 3rd Saturday with sawdust in his hair and a look on his face that Clara had come to recognize as his version of joy, contained precise expressed primarily through productivity. He went directly to the barn and worked until supper without being asked. The twins thawed at different speeds, which was somehow not surprising, given that they were supposedly identical. Anna thawed. First she began talking to Clara freely, then frequently, then at a volume and pace that occasionally required Clara to hold up one hand and say gently, "Breathe, Anna," which Anna received with the complete lack of offense of someone who knows they have this tendency and accepts it as a feature rather than a flaw. Rose awed, slower and more completely. One morning in January, she appeared beside Clara while Clara was mending and sat down and picked up the second needle without being asked, and they mended together in comfortable silence for an hour. And at the end of it, Rose said without looking up, "I like this." Clara said, "I do too." And that was all it needed to be. Benjamin stopped going to the window. Clara noticed the day it stopped, a Tuesday in November, ordinary afternoon, and she realized she had not seen him at the window since Monday, and then she realized she hadn't seen him there since before the hearing, and then she understood that sometime between the tally paper in his pocket and Lucy's voice in the courtroom, and the drive home through the rose-gold afternoon. Benjamin had quietly, privately, without announcement, decided that the person he was waiting for had arrived. She did not say anything about it to him. He did not say anything about it to her. Some things are known between people without needing to be said. It was Lydia who surprised her. Lydia had been unwinding slowly, like a clock spring that had been wound too tight for too long. Not all at once, not dramatically, but consistently in the specific way of a person who is genuinely healing rather than performing recovery. She smiled more. Not often, not easily, but the smiles that came were real, and they landed on her face the way her mother's smile had landed in the photograph Ethan had shown Clara, direct and unperformed, and worth more for the rarity. She started talking about school. Not the school in Willow Creek, which she'd attended before her mother died, and her father got sick, and everything fell apart. She started talking about it the way you talk about something you've been thinking about for a while, and are finally ready to say out loud. She mentioned a teacher she'd had named Mrs. Garfield, who had told her she had a precise mind. She mentioned a book she'd read that had made her think about something for 3 weeks straight. She mentioned very carefully, and without looking at Clara, that she thought she might like to go back. Then go back, Clara said. Lydia looked at her. "I've been out 2 years, she said. I'd be behind." "Lydia," Clara said, "you ran a household of 7 people at 13 years old. You are not behind." Lydia's chin came up in that way. It had the involuntary reflex of a girl who had learned to lead with her jaw when the world pushed. "People will talk," she said, "about me being in school with younger students." "Let them," Clara said. "You have better things to do than manage what people talk about." A pause. "Mrs. Garfield retired," Lydia said. "There's a new teacher." "Is she good?" Lydia said. "People say so." Clara looked at her steadily. "First Monday in January," Clara said. "I'll drive you myself." Lydia was quiet. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to," Clara said. "I'm going to." The first Monday in January, Clara drove Lydia to school. Lydia sat straight on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and said nothing for the first 20 minutes, which Clara had come to recognize as Lydia's way of managing something that cost her something. When they pulled up to the schoolhouse, Lydia climbed down and stood on the ground and looked at the building. "What if it's awful?" she said. Flat, not a question. "Then we figure out what's next," Clara said. "But I don't think it will be awful." Lydia turned and looked at her. "How do you always sound so sure?" she said. And for a moment, she sounded exactly like the age she was, 15 now, still 16 years from being an adult, still carrying more than she should have to carry, still sometimes desperately young under all that armor. "I'm not always sure," Clara said. "I'm just sure that you can handle it, and that's the only part that matters." Lydia turned back to the school. She walked to the door. She did not look back because Lydia never looked back. But before she went inside, she stood in the doorway for just a moment with her shoulders square and her chin up, and then she went in. Clara drove home and taught Lucy and Benjamin their letters at the kitchen table, and thought about a girl who had kept 6 children alive on her own, and was now going back to school, and felt something that she could only describe as fierce, uncomplicated love. Spring came. Then another winter. Then another spring. And on a morning in May of 1879, nearly 3 years after Clara Bennett had stepped off a train in Willow Creek with 2 suitcases and $43, Thomas Reed drove out to the ranch with a document that he set on the kitchen table while all 7 children and Clara gathered around it. "The territorial fraud case concluded last week," he said. "Caldwell pled to 2 counts. The properties he acquired through fraudulent survey manipulation are under review for restitution." He paused. "The Pruitt family has been notified. They may be able to reclaim what they lost." The kitchen was quiet. "And us," Ethan said. "Your property was never taken," Reed said. "Your documentation stands clean. What this does," he tapped the document, "is formally close any remaining challenge. There is no legal question left, no open dispute, no possibility of this being revisited." He looked at Clara. "It is finished." Clara looked at the document. She looked at the faces around the table. Ethan, 20 now, with his father's jaw and his own steady eyes. Lydia, 18, back in school for 2 years, and already talking about teaching herself one day. Samuel, 15, spending every spare hour in Henri Delacroix's workshop building things with his hands that would outlast all of them. Anna and Rose. 12, no longer pressed together quite so tightly, but still side by side, still whispering, still the private language of each other's company. Benjamin, 8, sitting with his tally paper on the table in front of him, out of habit, though there was nothing left to count. And Lucy, 6 years old, with her dark eyes and her complete certainty about the world, and Clara's sleeve in one fist. Clara looked at all of them. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. Reed folded the document and left it on the table and stood. "3 years ago," he said, and then stopped. He was not a sentimental man. He tried again. "When you walked into my office. Miss Bennet, I told you this was winnable. I believed that. But I want you to know I have never seen anyone fight for something the way you fought for this family." He picked up his hat. "It was an honor." He left. The kitchen was quiet again. Then Lydia said, "Someone should make coffee," and got up to start it, and the room came alive again in its ordinary way. Benjamin, sliding off his bench to follow Lydia, Anna, and Rose, immediately resuming a conversation that had apparently been interrupted by the legal proceedings. Samuel going back to the drawing he'd been working on for a new shelving commission. Ethan standing and stretching and looking at Clara with a look that said more than he was going to try to put into words. Lucy climbed into Clara's lap. She sat there for a moment looking up at Clara with her dark eyes. "Is the bad man gone?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. "The bad man is gone." Lucy considered this. "Good," she said, and put her head on Clara's shoulder. Clara held her and looked at the kitchen. Her kitchen. Their kitchen. This room that had started as the most exhausted version of itself, and had become through 3 winters and 1,000 ordinary mornings, and more grief and effort and love than she could ever put a number to the center of something real. That summer, Ethan hired a hand for the ranch, a young man from the East who reminded Clara in certain specific ways of no one so much as a younger version of herself. Someone who had arrived somewhere new, uncertain, trying to understand where they fit. She fed him well and asked him about his family, and gave him the good room in the outbuilding, and did not make him explain himself. And she watched Ethan treat him the same way, with the particular patience of someone who has been on the other end of that uncertainty and not forgotten it. One evening that fall, she and Ethan sat on the porch after supper, which had become their habit. The quiet time between the younger children's bedtime and the full dark. When the ranch was still, and the mountains were going purple at the edges, and the air had the particular cold and pine smell that Clara had come to think of as the smell of home. "I've been thinking," Ethan said. "About what?" "The east acreage, along the river." He had his coffee cup in both hands, elbows on knees, looking at the mountains. "Pa always said he wanted to run more cattle there once the boundary question was settled. It's good land, better than we're using it for." "How much would it cost to start?" he told her. She had the number in her head before he finished saying it. She'd been running the accounts for 3 years, and she knew exactly where they stood. "Spring," she said. "We can do it in spring." He looked at her. "You already knew," he said. "I keep the accounts," she said. He shook his head slightly. Not irritation, something closer to admiration, and the slight exasperation that sometimes accompanies it in people who are proud of someone they didn't expect to be proud of. "Pa knew," Ethan said. "When he wrote to you, he knew you were the right person." Clara looked at the mountains. "I think he was hoping," she said. "We were both hoping. That's different from knowing." "Maybe," Ethan said. "But he was right." They sat in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had built something together and both knew it. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said, "and you can say no." Clara waited. "The ranch," he said. "Pa named it Whitaker when he filed the homestead. But you've been you are." He stopped. Tried again. "This is your home too. As much as it's mine. As much as it's any of ours." He looked at her. "I don't think it should just be called Whitaker anymore." Clara looked at him. "What were you thinking?" she said. He reached into his coat pocket and set a piece of paper on the bench between them. Clara picked it. In Ethan's careful handwriting, she'd seen enough of it over 3 years to know the particular neat pressure of his letters. It said, Whitaker Bennett Ranch. Clara looked at it for a long time. She looked at the mountains. She thought about a train platform in August of 1876, and 2 suitcases, and a letter going soft along the fold lines, and a 15-year-old boy saying there are 7 of us at home. She thought about the first night's supper, and Lucy asleep against her arm. She thought about Lydia at 2 in the morning, with her hands around a cup of warm milk. She thought about Benjamin's tally paper, and Samuel's cedar shelves, and the twins' constant twin language, and a courtroom, and a small clear voice saying, "That's our ma." She thought about a man she'd never met, who had described sunflowers as the only flower brave enough to follow the sun, and who had known or hoped, which in her experience was close enough that she was the right person. She folded the paper along Ethan's crease. "Yes," she said. Ethan took the paper back and put it in his pocket, and they sat on the porch in the dark as the stars came out over the Colorado mountains, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The next Sunday, Reverend Hartwell announced from his pulpit that the Whitaker Bennett Ranch would be hosting its first community harvest gathering the following month, and that all were welcome, and that Miss Clara Bennett, which was what most of the town still called her, which she had stopped correcting because it had become a kind of title rather than a name, had personally promised enough food for twice the number that could reasonably fit in the yard. A promise that everyone who had eaten her cooking knew she would keep. People came. More than twice the number that could reasonably fit in the yard. Margaret Haynes brought 3 pies and her opinions, which she distributed with equal generosity. Harlan Cole came in his good coat with his old badge still on his vest and stood near the fence most of the afternoon, watching the children run and wearing the expression of a man who is seeing something worth watching. The Delacroix family came all 3 generations, and Samuel spent most of the afternoon in the corner of the yard showing Henri's grandson a dovetail joint with the focused intensity of someone passing on something that matters. Lydia organized the food tables with the crisp efficiency of someone who had been running a household since she was 13, and now ran it with enough practice to make it look easy. She had brought her school books to show Clara something she'd written an essay. The teacher had marked it with the note "exceptional clarity of thought," and she held it out to Clara with a casualness that didn't quite cover how much the showing mattered. Clara read it. "Lydia," she said. "It's probably nothing," Lydia said immediately. "It's not nothing," Clara said. "It's remarkable." Lydia took the essay back. "He says I could teach," she said, still casual, still covering. "I know," Clara said. "You could." "I'm thinking about it." "Think as long as you need to," Clara said. "Then do it." Lydia put the essay in her pocket and went back to organizing the food tables, and Clara watched her go with the particular feeling that she had come to recognize over 3 years as the specific texture of watching someone become themselves. Late in the afternoon, when the gathering had settled into its final slow hours, and the little ones were running in the yard, and the adults were talking in clusters, and the mountains were going that particular rose gold again, Clara stood at the edge of the yard with a cup of coffee and looked at all of it. She saw Ethan talking with 2 neighboring ranchers leaning on the fence with the easy authority of a man who knows his land and his work and doesn't need to announce it. She saw Samuel still at his dovetail demonstration, which had acquired 3 more observers. She saw the twins chasing Benjamin around the yard in a game that had rules Clara could not entirely follow, but that involved considerable running and more noise than strictly necessary. She saw Lydia at the table, capable and precise, and she was laughing at something Margaret had said. A real laugh, full-throated, uncovered. The laugh of a girl who had finally, after everything, decided the world had earned it. She felt a small hand find hers. She looked down. Lucy stood beside her looking at the same scene. "Clara," Lucy said. She still alternated between Clara and Ma with the fluid pragmatism of a 6-year-old who had decided that one person could hold 2 names. "Are we happy?" Clara looked at the yard full of her family and her neighbors, and the evidence of everything that had been built in 3 years from 2 suitcases and $43, and the decision not to walk back to the station. "Yes," she said. "We are." Lucy swung their joined hands once satisfied. "Good," she said. "Me too." And that was how it was. Years later, when the children of Willow Creek grew up and had children of their own, and those children asked about the Whitaker Bennett Ranch and the woman who had built it, the stories they heard were specific and ordinary and true. They heard about the cellar shelf made of cedar. They heard about the tally paper with the neat marks. They heard about the ride to school on the first Monday in January. They heard about a courtroom and a small girl who pointed at a woman from Ohio and said, "That's our Ma," with the complete certainty of someone stating a fact that has always been true and has simply been waiting to be said out loud. What they heard underneath all of it was the same story in different forms. The story of a woman who arrived on a train looking for a future and found one that was harder and stranger and more real than anything she had dared to hope for, and who chose it fully and without reservation, and who held it together through 2 winters and 1 courtroom and 7 children and more ordinary mornings than anyone counted, until what she had built was so solid that nothing could move it. Clara Bennett had come west looking for a husband. She had found something that no letter, no advertisement, no careful hoping had prepared her for. She had found a family that chose her back. And in the choosing, in the daily, unglamorous, irreversible act of staying, she had finally completely become exactly who she was always meant to be.